Guys, this is Anthony from Anthony's Customs, and for this review we're going to look at the SOTA Street Fighter Dhalsim. Now, this starting with Dhalsim and the rest of the figures I'm going to review, not counting Goken, are these guys, or counting Dan technically, these guys are from the Revolutions line, which is not the same SOTA as the SOTA that made the rest of the figures. It's the same company but different people. And it shows in the figures. There's slightly different styling, slightly different style of articulation, and a different style of quality as well. We'll talk about that as we go through the figure, but let's go through the figure. So that's the blue variant, that's the 2-pack gray variant, same exact figure, same accessories other than paint of course. So we're going to set these guys aside and look at the Player 1 version, which is the one most people are concerned with. Before we get into anything, we'll talk about accessories. He only has the one head, which is a good head sculpt, I think. I do like the head sculpt. But it's kind of unfinished, and we'll talk about that once we get into the figure more. He's got a total of 4 hands. He's got 1 fist for each side. There's the fists. And 1 of these open hands for each side as well. They did paint the fingernails, but the sculpt is lacking just a little bit. What is going on with my lighting? My big head was blocking the lighting. Okay, I think that'll be a little better. Okay, so he's got 4 hands. Then he has these regular arms here, as you can see. Still a little bit lanky, but then he also has these extended arms for his iconic moves. There's no articulation in them other than the wrist that's normal and the bicep swivel. And what you do for these is you just unpeg these from the joint. You can kind of see the peg in there, and then these peg on just like they would any normal piece of articulation. So you can make him doing his stretchy moves. He's got 1 for each side, of course. The sculpt is actually pretty good. I like the way these turned out. Here's the problem. Dhalsim is incredibly fragile. Most of the Revolutions are, but he's incredibly fragile, so swapping these out can be very problematic. You could rip joints apart, you could break stuff. So I haven't done it on any of mine ever, to be completely honest, which is unfortunate, but if you use hot water, you're probably going to be okay as long as you're careful as well. But still, it's really quite risky, and I don't recommend it. Before we put the accessories away, I want to show you they did do some good paint work. There's some nice shading in the musculature. Hopefully that's showing up because it's not super intense. It's really subtle, but that's what I like about it, because skin painting shouldn't have really harsh fake shadows. Then they did a pretty good job with the paint work on the wrist wraps. So pretty good. He has, if you want to count this as an accessory, his skull necklace, which is the rope's really too long, I think, but it is a pretty good. They did a pretty good job with it. The skulls are nicely sculpted and fairly nicely painted. I think they look pretty good, and it's a real rope necklace, by the way. Okay, so let's talk about the problems with these figures. Aside from being either incredibly loose, some parts are really loose, like right there, it's really loose. If it didn't have a hitch on it, it'd spin all the way around like a helicopter. This extra joint, which is kind of like the butterfly joint on the NECA Street Fighter figures or the Play Art Sky figures, it's really like a ball joint, more like the Figma, or not Figma, what's it called? Figure Arts figures, actually, now that I think about it. Like the Dragon Ball Z figures, they have that extra joint. He has it 9.999 times out of 10, it's going to be stuck. And trying to free it up will 9.999 times out of 10 break something. So I've never done that on any of my figures. I just leave it where it is and live with it. If you do try to free it up, you're more than likely going to break the peg that holds the shoulder into it, or break the whole thing that's held on inside, or break this off right here. It's just, the plastic is not the best that they used, and it's really, really stuck in there. If you find a bootleg one, they tend to move a lot more freely, but everything on the bootlegs is incredibly loose rather than just a little bit loose. The hips are pretty loose on this guy. He's got the T-jointed hips, kind of like some of the newer Marvel Legends, where the thigh moves like this and has the hinge on the side. There's no swivel in there. The swivel comes inside the shorts. So they're a little bit loose front to back, but that's about it. Everything else is relatively tight. Sometimes it's stuck, but it's not too bad. And then the wrist pegs, I guess they were afraid of making them too easily broken, so they made them pretty loose. And the pegs are just kind of not the best design for the pegs. They're really stumpy pegs, so they don't hold on very well. So the wrists tend to be loose. One other thing that's kind of a problem is the wrist bracelet things. When you are swapping out hands or posing him, these things are made out of pretty brittle plastic, so do not grab onto them while you're doing it because they'll snap. They'll still be usable, but it will crack and separate the ring, so be careful about that. Sometimes his abdominal section is really loose, but this one's pretty good, and I haven't had too much trouble with that personally. The paint on these guys is pretty well done. It's in line with the rest of the SOTA figures. There's nice shading throughout the skin. There's decent shading throughout the shorts. His looks a little bit kind of ratty, and I think that was intentional because the other ones don't have that. I think they did this sort of shading to make it look like it was worn and dirty. That's my guess. It's not the best paint job. There's some bleeding around the belt, but it's not bad, and it's definitely good enough to be passable. I'm not stoked. I can't believe I just said stoked. I don't say that. I'm not happy with the painting, but it's definitely passable, so that's okay. As far as the sculpt goes now, he has what we call UFS. No, just two S's. Unfinished Sculpt Syndrome. I know that the U and the F should not be separate, but they are for the sake of sounding better. And particularly noticeable in the hands and in the feet. The sculpt looks really, really rough. You can see it in the palm there. There's all kinds of texture that doesn't look right. The creases aren't sculpted well. The feet in particular are kind of chunky looking. It's just not the best. And it is the same for the body somewhat. It's not as bad. The head looks pretty well done, but it still looks like there's maybe just one more level of touch-up work that's needed on it. And that's how it is for a lot of the Revolutions figures, particularly Dhalsim and Honda, and we'll talk about Honda when we do him. But it's not a huge problem for me because he still looks good from any distance at all. But if you get up close, you'll see that the sculpt is still really quite rough. So the whole Revolutions line is lacking compared to the rest of them, but since they are part of the original 8 and they're still decent figures, especially compared to other companies like Jazzwares, these are more than okay. So I do recommend you pick them up. At least get the Player 1 version of Dhalsim. Watch out for bootlegs because that'll happen, but it's still a decent figure. Let's talk about the articulation real quick. The head is on a is it a double? Yeah, double ball peg. So pretty good range of motion. Not a ton, but at least enough. The shoulders, like I said, have that extra butterfly type of joint, but it's frozen, so it's just a ball disc joint. Bicep swivel, double jointed elbow, wrist swivel with a pivot. His abdomen, he has an ab crunch, plus the ab crunch itself is connected to a ball peg, so a double ball peg, so he can actually rotate like a Play Arts figure. He has the sideways motion, front to back, rotation, everything. He has a waist twist inside there. We already talked about the hips. It's kind of like a T-joint, so forward, back, and then it has the hinge for side to side, a thigh swivel, double jointed knees, ankle pivot, and then he's got the same kind of ankle rocker as the new Marvel Legends, to where there's a peg from that disc that sticks into the foot horizontally so that the foot can rotate like that. So pretty good range of motion, pretty good set of articulation, pretty good paint, and decent sculpt. So these guys are still worth getting. They're just problematic. As far as scale goes, some people say they're a little bit too tall to be in scale with the rest of the SOTAs. Those people might be right, but he's only 6.5 inches tall, so it's definitely close enough to where I'm okay with it. So there's Dhalsim. Stay tuned for the rest of the Street Fighter figures, and in the meantime, keep collecting.